and welcome back to Bethlem Museum of the Mind's book club. If you have a copy of Fiona Tan's book 10 Madnesses, I hope you have had a chance to read up to page 78 by now. If you don't have a copy but have an interest in the way people, especially people suffering from mental distress, have been represented in portraiture, do watch this video anyway, and if it inspires you to want your own copy of the book, send us an email at info.motm.org.uk and we'll send you details. Well, I'm here next to this exquisite portrait of Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother, which we may imagine was completed in happier times before the arrival of the wolf in the fairy tale. I hope you can see that in her face there's radiant goodness and kindly generosity pouring forth, and grand maternal security, which Little Red Riding Hood took for granted, repaid in loyalty and devotion, which she was horrified to lose in an instant of too late recognition, and which she was grateful to receive again upon her knife-edge rescue. Well, at least this is how a group of us was recently invited to see this portrait by Caroline, our museum's former head of learning, who some years ago moved on to bigger and better things at the National Gallery, but visited Bethlem earlier this year to guide our appreciation of the portraits, actually of Bethlem patients, commissioned by Dr. Alexander Morrison. This picture is in fact one of these patients and is one of several that are on temporary loan to us from the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh. And it's featured in Morrison's book, Physiognomy of Mental Diseases. There, the lady serves as an example of monomania with elated ideas. Morrison tells us that she believes that King George III had abdicated in her favour, and that she was Queen Betty, that she had millions of pounds to her credit, and that she owned St James's Park and Bethlem Hospital. Whereas, in fact, she was a poor widow who went out into the country to make a little money by gathering hops, but found on her return that her nephew had defrauded her of the little she had. The historic records of Bethlem Hospital, which we care for here at the museum, tell us that her name was Elizabeth Carroll. So the point my former colleague Caroline was trying to make was that we often see what we expect to see when we look at portraits, and that our expectations can be shaped to a very great degree by information given by a caption or by a tour guide. When I said that this portrait was of Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother, I didn't expect you actually to believe me, because the context supplied by this book club and these series of videos are a strong indication that this portrait is probably of a patient at Bethlem Hospital in the early 19th century, which it is. But it doesn't follow that these are the characteristic features of someone with monomania with elated ideas. To think that would be to reduce Elizabeth Carroll down just to her 19th century diagnosis. In her features, I hope we can see a person whose identity is bigger than her diagnosis. Perhaps we can even see a person of radiant goodness and kindly generosity. Well, this is akin to the search that Fiona Tan embarks upon with respect to the subjects of Theodore Géricault's famous portraits from page 51 of 10 Madnesses onwards. To do this, she had to search amongst the medical records of Parisian asylums, notably La Salpêtrière and Bicêtre hospitals, looking for patients answering to the descriptions given to the monomaniac portraits. As you'll know from reading the book, the problem she runs up against in doing this is the scarcity of records for this period. Recorded observations of just 11 Salpêtrière patients survive for 1822, the year in which Géricault probably painted these pictures. And the Bicêtre records are far too concise for any meaningful connection to be made with the portraits. Tan is able to find diagnostic categories such as religious monomania, and monomania with pride in records dating from 1827, along with patients who believe themselves to have royal connections or power over the weather. How beautiful to believe that you can control the sun, the wind and the rain, she comments. This is the closest Tan gets to Géricault's man with delusions of military rank, or indeed Morrison's Queen Betty, i.e. close enough to see that those diagnosed with monomania of various sorts were being admitted to hospital, but not close enough to make it possible to give a name to any of Géricault's sitters. The situation would have been very different had the portraits Morrison commissioned been the subject of Tan's study, because Elizabeth Carroll, whom I'm talking about this week, and Elizabeth Jeffreys, who I discussed last week, are just two examples of many people whom it is possible to identify by name in Bethlem Hospital's medical records from the details given by Morrison in the Physiognomy of Mental Diseases. Ironically, it's even possible that Morrison himself could have met one or more of the patients painted by Géricault, because in 1818 he travelled to Paris, visited l'Île Salpêtrière and Bicêtre hospitals, as well as Charenton Hospital. He observed conditions there, he interviewed Dr. Esquirol, he interacted with some of his patients and wrote up his impressions in a series of papers which don't give the names of any of patients, but which are accessible on our museum website. These are worth reading alongside Fiona Tan's account from page 51 onwards of life in these Parisian asylums. As she is unable to identify any of Géricault's subjects in the hospital records she consults, Fiona Tan circles back to the question, so what is monomania? It is, she acknowledges, a term which cannot be understood outside its early 19th century context. In her account, Dr. Esquirol described it as a partial delirium, an unhealthy obsession with an ID fixed, but one that leaves them completely rational on unrelated subjects. Likewise, Alexander Morrison, in his Physiognomy of Mental Diseases, describes cases of insanity in which we find a small number of predominant and exclusive ideas upon which the attention is fixed. According to him, monomania is characterized by delirium on certain points only, the mind retaining its accustomed vigor and mode of thinking on other points. Both Esquirol and Morrison would have been optimistic about the chances for Elizabeth Carroll, as pictured here, and others like her, as well as for Géricault's man with delusions of military grandeur. They regarded monomania as a partial and as a recoverable loss of rationality. As Fiona Tan reports on page 70 of her book, Esquirol further believed that all madmen possess some measure of rationality, and thus remain human. While I'm glad that 19th century doctors regarded their patients as human, I'm not sure that this test of rationality, as applied in the Age of Enlightenment, represents an advance on what went before. What went before was the staking of human nature upon being created in the image of God. In that older understanding, people were understood to be human by virtue of bearing the divine imprint, prior to the development of rational faculties, as in the case of babies and infants, or in the absence of this development, as in the conditions listed by Tan on page 54 of her book, in the confronting terminology of the age, fools, idiots, and cretins, and subsequent to the loss of these faculties, as in the cases of those in demented or comatose states. One of those confronting terms hints at the basis of this understanding. The word cretin was derived from chrétien and was originally intended to highlight the obligation of those in Christian Europe to treat their most unfortunate fellow citizens as brothers and sisters in a common faith. As soon as rationality became the test of humanity, it is not clear on what basis the human dignity of those that fail to meet that test may be maintained. Well, we're on the home straight for the book club now, and if you have a copy of 10 Madnesses, I'd be glad if you were able to read right through to the end of the book in preparation for the next and last video in this series, which will be launched on the museum's YouTube channel and Facebook account a week from today.